All right, welcome back to another nutrition discussion for the spring 2022 semester. This is the second one, and today we are going to be talking about ketosis or the keto diet. So if you haven't met me before, my name is Andy Sykes. I'm the nutrition specialist here at Wichita State University Campus Rec. And as I said, we're going to go and talk about the keto diet. This is kind of a fad diet, well-used diet by some people. But what is it? What does it do? Why are people doing it? And kind of what's the actual physiology happening in the body to actually give it its success? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let me share my screen and we'll get into that. All right, so hopefully you'll see my slide show here, keto diet, ketosis, again, my name there. And I've got a food pyramid shown on the left side that kind of shows that the majority of our foods here in the keto diet are high fat, kind of low protein, very low carbohydrate. Okay, our carbs are going to come from our fruits and vegetables, and we really want to minimize the amount of carbohydrate intake to utilize ketosis, and that's the breakdown and use of ketones from fat. And so we're going to talk more about that and what goes into the process. And so hopefully you have a better understanding of what I'm actually saying here as we go through these slides. But yeah, let's get started. Just a preface as we go forward here, I'm not recommending this diet to anyone. This is purely educational. I want you to understand what ketosis is, and anytime you are going to change your diet, whether you're increasing or decreasing using supplements, you should always consult your physician first. So I want to put that out there. This is purely educational. So why would you use a keto diet? What is this about? Well, the majority of people that do it comes because of weight loss. People want to try to go low carbohydrate. People try that. Low carb would be regarded as under 130 grams a day, which is the RDA, the recommended daily allowance. When you go even lower than that, you start to go into the increasing ketone use for energy. And that is because of what's fueling our body. Okay, so again, we're going to get into that a little bit more in a second. The number one population, if you were to say, that uses a keto diet is those that have epilepsy and they have seizures. And that's because carbohydrates, when broken down, and that's what the keto diet is removal of carbohydrate. When you break that down, you get glucose. And glucose is the preferred energy substrate of pretty much all cells in the body. It is really easily metabolized, it's quickly metabolized, and it can produce energy. So the brain likes to use it, the muscle cells like to use it, the liver likes to use it. What happens with epilepsy is that we get too much glucose in the brain, which causes some of these seizures. Now, I don't know a lot about seizures, so I won't talk on it, but what we find is that if you minimize carbohydrate intake, minimize the availability of blood glucose, minimize its basically use in the brain, you actually see and inhibit seizures. And so that's the main population that use it would be those suffering from epilepsy. The other side of it would be, as I mentioned before, the weight loss. And the weight loss comes as you generally going to be eating less if you eat less carbohydrates. Not always the case though, because it is calories in, calories out. What we do find the big part of the weight loss coming from a keto diet is the water retention that you'll lose. Now, when you eat carbohydrates and you store them as glycogen, once they get into storage, they store with 3 to 4 grams of H2O, so water, every gram of a carbohydrate. Now, people will normally eat more than 130 grams a day. So you imagine you've got 400 or 500 grams of water that you're storing with that. And when you cut that out of your diet, you will see a decrease, an almost immediate first month, 10, 15 pound decrease in weight, because you're not holding on to glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, what carbs are broken down from. Okay, so we see this decrease in weight, weight shift, and then progressively we see that decrease kind of level out and plateau because you don't have any more water to lose. Okay, and then it goes back to energy and energy out, and weight loss kind of doesn't happen as rapidly. The final thing that people note when they're on the keto diet, and people actually try to repeat the process because of this, is the mental clarity that they'll get with the diet. A lot of people mention that they feel better when they're in a fasted state, when they don't have carbs in their system and they're relying on ketosis for energy production in the brain. And so that's why some people do it, is to get that. Now, there has been studies done on this, and we can look at the neurons firing in your brain from stimuli, and your brain 100% works better, more efficiently with glucose. That is not an argument. It is better with glucose. It's sharper. It's more specific to stimuli and response. But there is the anecdotal, I feel better, I feel more clarity. And a lot of people say this is not a one-off thing, that they feel, they like that change in awareness and consciousness that comes with the low glucose. Okay, but it is proven you will have enhanced cognition, enhanced coordination, firing of neurons, and detail to their firing with glucose. Okay, so what is it all about? It's a diet, so we have to take it back to energy. Okay, that is what diets are all about, controlling energy in and energy out of the body. Ketosis, though, has some major key players, and that comes from the changes that we're going to have. We're going to lower the carbohydrate in ketone, really minimizing it to almost zero. So in this conversation, we've got to talk about glucose. Okay, that is what carbs are broken down to. It doesn't matter where it starts, whether it's bread and rice, cereals, granola, I mean, whatever it is, I mean, even soda, anything that is carbohydrate, we commonly just say sugar in our world, breaks down to glucose, blood glucose, and then it's distributed around the body. Now, cells can uptake this glucose, the liver can uptake it, the brain loves glucose and it uses it. And when we need it, we can metabolize it through glycolysis. When we don't need it, we want to store it. And with storage form of glucose is glycogen. So just in storage, glucose becomes glycogen, and it's a lot more complex in its structure. And you have to break that back down in order to get the glucose back out. In order to do that, the storage of glucose to glycogen, we use a hormone known as insulin. And this comes from our pancreas, and its role is when you consume carbohydrates, once they're broken down in the intestines and released into the blood, insulin's role detects that and it enhances uptake. Okay, so it's an anabolic hormone that allows you to increase storage of glucose to glycogen in our muscles and our liver. Glucagon is the opposite hormone, also from the pancreas, and its role is to release glycogen into glucose into the blood. Okay, so when you have low carbohydrate food, fasted or low carbohydrate kind of environment, now we're running out of blood glucose. The brain likes blood glucose. Our muscles prefer blood glucose. They can contract easier with it, quicker. And so when you deplete that and you start to run low on blood sugar, well, now we can release it from storage, and glucagon's the hormone that enhances that release. Now, it doesn't just release glycogen to glucose, it also has a role in releasing triglycerides. Okay, triglycerides are what our fat is, our adipose tissue that we have storage energy underneath our skin. Those are stored as triglycerides, and glucagon actually enhances our ability to break those down into fatty acids. And triglyceride would be a glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acids. So you get to pull out those fatty acids and metabolize those for energy. And that's done a lot more slowly. It's aerobically metabolized, but this is kind of where the switch happens with the keto diet, is that how can we use fatty acids versus glucose to fuel the brain? Now, fatty acids cannot get to the brain. They can't go past the blood-brain barrier. So although glucose can, fat can't. And so you can't fuel the brain with fat like you can fuel muscles that way. And so we have to rely on something else. And that's the last part of this discussion. That's the ketones that we have to create to fuel the brain. Now, ketones are a result of the breakdown of fatty acids in order to fuel the brain. Okay, the liver, this happens in the liver. We break down the carbon chains on the fatty acids, and we deliver those, and they can pass through the blood-brain barrier, and they can be metabolized aerobically in the mitochondria of nerve cells. And that's what our brain is, a bunch of nerve cells, right? Central nervous system. And so it's a process. Those are the kind of key players. It is all about cellular respiration, the production of energy, and either using glucose with glycolysis, fatty acids through lipolysis, or this production of ketones, and then ketosis, the breakdown of ketones for energy that we're about to move into. So as I've mentioned before, the preferred substrate to be utilized for energy production and maintenance of life is glucose. We love it, okay? Our brain loves it. We have many different dopamine releases when we consume sweet things, not only by taste, but also the craving of the want of carbohydrates, because the brain uses it, because it's easy for our muscles to use, because the liver likes it too, okay? When we do consume carbohydrates, we break them down into glucose. Okay, it takes a little bit of a process through the intestines, but we break it down. The liver gets the first look at that, and they can store it as glycogen, or it can release into the blood, flows around the blood. Other muscles, other cells can uptake that glucose and store it again as glycogen. As I mentioned before, the main hormones controlling glucose blood levels, okay, insulin is the anabolic one. That's the uptake from the blood to storage. And glucagon, which is the release of glycogen to glucose in the blood. So if we need to increase blood sugar, glucagon is used. If we need to decrease blood sugar, insulin is used. Okay, and that's how the body's controlling this. And we want a nice even amount, homeostatic percent of sugar in the blood to fuel all of our body processes, but mainly this central nervous system. Our brain needs a constant flow, and it's going to use about 130 grams a day. Okay, that's roughly what the brain takes, and that's why the RDA, the recommended daily allowance, is 130 grams. Okay, it takes about 12 to 14 hours or being fasted, not eating, for your blood sugar to be really dropping and glycogen start to deplete as it's trying to refuel the blood and give it to the brain. Okay, so you start to really deplete. Overnight, you know, you're fasted, hopefully 8 hours of sleep. You're going to be fasted at that point, and you're going to be running out of glucose. And so why breakfast is often, you're breaking the fast, and you have normally a high amount of carbohydrate intake in your breakfast foods. You're trying to get that blood sugar and glycogen stores back. So yeah, moving on through this. Hopefully you understand this. Again, another just illustration here on the slide showing the role of either glucagon and insulin on blood sugar. When blood sugar is high, meaning you must have just eaten something that's released glucose, increases the blood glucose, insulin will then increase and decrease the blood glucose back to its normal level. And we know this as glycogenesis, okay? The production of glycogen from glucose, we store it. When it's low, either when you're exercising a lot using that fuel, or you're in a fasted state, okay, when you're not eating much, your brain's going to continue, your muscles going to continue to use that fuel source. Even at low intensities, we have to break it down and make more available. And glucagon is the hormone that controls that. And we call this glycogenolysis. So the breakdownolysis of glycogen to glucose. The other way you can do this is the liver can go through gluconeogenesis. Okay, this is the production of new glucose molecules, and it can do this from different substrates that aren't carbohydrates. So different amino acids or protein. It can do it from lactate. It can do it from fatty acids. It basically takes a non-carbohydrate, breaks it down, and produces a glucose molecule from it. So when blood sugar is low, gluconeogenesis can happen and release glucose into the blood. Now, it can't do a lot of that. It's like, I think 50 grams a day. So it's really not a huge amount that it can do. Not enough to really fuel the brain full time, okay, when the brain needs about 130 grams a day. So when blood sugar is low, when you're fasted or you're at a low carb intake through keto diets, and how it's going to relate back to that conversation, we've got gluconeogenesis that can happen, and then we've got ketosis. Okay, so those two, as I mentioned before, glycogenolysis, the breakdown of glycogen, the storage form of glucose into the blood, or gluconeogenesis, the production of new glucose molecules in the liver. Why would we do those? Again, it's when blood sugar goes low, we need to produce glucose for the blood. That would happen in about 12 to 14 hours. Okay, we start to have that depletion of blood glucose and even glycogen. Or we can make it happen real quick, and we can do some steady state exercise. Okay, we can, or even higher intensity, it's going to burn it even quicker. We'll start to use the blood sugar. That will be depleted. Glycogen will be released. That will be depleted. And so steady state, you'll get real low blood sugar if you exercise for a long period of time. Okay, so we can make it happen a lot quicker. Commonly, though, it happens when you're fasted. Okay, whether that's intermittent fasting, whether that's you're asleep, whether you're just not eating, you're not eating, so carbohydrate intake isn't happening, blood sugar starts to deplete. Also happens when you're on a low carb diet. Okay, so if you are eating, but you're not eating carbohydrate, you're not breaking things down to glucose, you're not refueling the blood, and you're not refueling your glycogen stores. So low carb diets, and that's what ketosis is a very low carb diet, really quite minimal. You don't have any glucose, and we have to start looking at how can I produce glucose, or how can I fuel the brain, how can I fuel my body alternatively. Untreated diabetes, okay, that's with type 1, where you don't produce insulin. That means you can't uptake glucose to glycogen, so that there is no storage. That means you're going to run out of glucose real quickly. So type 1 diabetics, we're going to struggle with this too, and they would inject insulin to help storage happen. But most normal populations, all you need to do is eat carbohydrates, and you'll kick out of ketosis and be back to regularly burning glucose. Okay, then understand lipolysis. Okay, so we're building hopefully our understanding of this, and then we can talk about the diet itself, knowing the functions that are at play. Lipolysis is the breakdown of lipids, fat. Okay, now 98% of all the fats we consume, the fats that we store on our body as body fat, are triglycerides. Okay, and there's a picture there on the top left. It is you see the red molecules there, is a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids, and you can see the 3 arms that are moving out from that center point. So it's a sugar alcohol, it's a sugar molecule with 3 fatty acids. Okay, and what the process of lipolysis is breaking down these fatty acids from the glycerol backbone. They become free fatty acids, free from their binding, and they can be metabolized aerobically within the mitochondria, and they get turned, and they go through a process known as beta oxidation, and they can basically cleaved off 2 carbons at a time and converted to acetyl-CoA, or acetyl coenzyme A. And that then has a role in the Krebs cycle with aerobic energy production. You can see on the right side that the Krebs cycle is shown there, and acetyl-CoA is that #1 first kind of process in that cycle. And then it moves to citrate and so on. That's how we're producing our universal energy product, ATP, okay, with fat. Now, when you get fat being broken down, this is the traditional way that it's done. But when there is no carbohydrates, we need to be able to still fuel the brain, and fatty acid can't be used. It can't go through the blood-brain barrier. So we have difficulty in fueling the brain, and it's going to be uncomfortable. We actually get something called the keto flu, which is about 3 days in when you stop taking carbohydrates. You get that dehydration because you're not storing the water, that we don't feel great. and we need to be able to fuel the body. Insulin's going to drop because there's no sugar coming in, no glucose coming in, there's nothing to store. So insulin drops, which is a good thing. And we start to see an increase in these ketone bodies. That's what they're called, ketones. And what ketones are is the breakdown of fatty acids in the liver to a fuel source that can be used by the brain. Now, there are three main ketones, and they're shown on the screen right now: acetoacetate, beta-hydroxybutyrate, and acetone, the strong smelling stuff to remove nail varnish. And actually has a role when you start to have more of these ketones being produced from a low carb, high fat diet. You actually get a change in your breath because of these ketones that are being produced. And then ketones can be used in the brain through the aerobic energy production in the mitochondria of the nerve cells, and they can produce energy. So that's going back to brain power. Ketones can be used when glucose isn't available. The brain doesn't like to do it as much, but it can. And let me go back 2 slides here. And you see this Krebs cycle and see kind of what's happening. Well, with ketone use, you are breaking down these acetyl-CoA molecules, and you're able to actually use ketones in the Krebs cycle. So ketones can actually enter here, and they can be broken down to acetyl-CoA and actually go through the mitochondria. Now, you can't do that with lipolysis of fatty acids. The main reason is because when you are in low carbohydrate as a diet, gluconeogenesis is happening. Okay, now this is again still in the liver. So when you have low carbs, you want to produce glucose. Okay, you've got no glucose coming in through the diet, so the body wants to produce it. The liver will do this through gluconeogenesis. And one of the roles that this gluconeogenesis process does uses one of our substrates, oxalic acetate. And when it's being used through gluconeogenesis, it actually it becomes hydrolyzed. So we add a hydrogen to it, and it can be turned to malate for the production of glucose. Okay, when it's being used that way, it can't be used through the Krebs cycle. It's not here, so we can't get to this and move forward. So going around, you'd be missing a step, and it's being used as through gluconeogenesis rather than through lipolysis. Ketones are the answer to that, because they don't require it, and they can go and become acetyl-CoA, enzyme A, and become brain fuel. And so that's where we got to there. So what is this diet? Now we understand, okay, when you lower your carb intake, you have a response that the blood doesn't have glucose. Glycogen becomes depleted as it's trying to fill glucose into the blood, and the brain loves glucose. We like to use that. When it becomes less and less available, the body will use the liver to try and produce more glucose through gluconeogenesis. But it can't produce enough, about 50 grams a day. You need about 130 to fuel the brain. So there's a lot left that it's not getting fuel, and the brain's not going to be happy with that. It resolves that by using fatty acid breakdown into ketones, and ketones can then go through the blood and go through the blood-brain barrier to the nerve cells. Those can then be metabolized through the Krebs cycle. And just like a fat would be in a muscle cell, it can then go through and have an ATP production. The diet for a keto is minimize carbs, okay? So normally you'll see roughly 5% of your diet consisting of carbohydrate, not much at all. So 2,000 calorie diet, you're really talking about 100 calories of carbohydrate, so less than 50 grams of carb. Then you've got a good chunk of protein. Now, the important thing is not to have too much protein, okay? Because when you think about that, the steps that the body takes to produce glucose, gluconeogenesis can use protein amino acids to produce glucose. So if you have a huge protein percentage in your diet, then you're not going to become not going to go into ketosis, because your body's producing glucose through gluconeogenesis, and you're supplying lots of protein for it to do that. So it's low carb, but it's also quite low protein. If you go too high on the protein, you won't have the ketones rise. The other part of that is fat. Okay, you've got to have a lot of fat in your diet. Okay, you need the fuel, you need to still get the calories to stay alive and maintain energy production. So 70%, 80% of your diet needs to come from fat. Okay, and that's where you'll start to see the ketones being increased. Just got to be careful. Too much fat is never going to be a good thing. We do want to balance our calories. It is still energy in, energy out. We're just kind of manipulating the systems that are using the energy and that are at play. Okay, well, that's kind of what ketosis is. Okay, so if you're watching this for extra credit for my class, go ahead and email me the code word ketones, and that will get you your extra credit. And you can email that to andy.sykes@wichita.edu. And hopefully you found this useful. Hopefully you understand a little bit more about what ketosis is. And kind of don't forget, you've got to have low carbs, you've got to have slightly lower protein. Okay, can't have high protein diet with it, because you're just going to have carbohydrate being produced through gluconeogenesis. So got to have high fat, then it can be broken down and oxidized and create these ketones. They will elevate in the blood. Now, there are some caveats, there's some negatives to it. If you do it for too long, we do see some negative effects that we have to be conscious of. Of course, I mentioned the keto flu that comes pretty much straight away when you start this diet. It's pretty unenjoyable. The brain and the body's used to using carbs and glucose. When you stop supplying those, it has to adapt, and that's always uncomfortable. Adaptation is the whole process of becoming uncomfortable to becoming comfortable again. And so it's not very nice. And that mainly is because of the decrease in hydration. So if you are going to try a ketone diet, make sure you're drinking enough water. Make sure you've got electrolytes coming in, because as you lose that water weight, you're going to lose electrolytes with it. And that's what kind of gives this headache, the grogginess, what we call the ketone flu. Prolonged use in it would start to build up acidity in the body, and that can have a whole number of different effects, from calcium leaching and all sorts of stuff, which is maybe another conversation for later. But short term, not bad for you, can definitely be advantageous. Just understand what you're doing. And again, this isn't a recommendation to try it, just information on it. And if you are considering it, definitely talk to your physician before you do so. Hope you found it useful. Have a great day. See you later.